This is Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski.
We're going to talk about Sandra Birchmore. She was a 23-year-old pregnant woman who was found dead in her Massachusetts apartment in 2021. Initially, it was ruled a suicide, but now at the center of it all involves a federal murder case involving her former mentor, Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell. Turns out it wasn't just some tragic mistake or mental health crisis. It was, according to prosecutors, a cover-up for years of grooming, abuse, and exploitation that started when Sandra was 15 in the Police Explorer program. Farwell allegedly strangled her to keep her quiet, then staged the scene like a bad Lifetime movie. The kicker? Multiple officers were entangled in her life, but so far only Farwell has been charged. Everyone else quietly resigned. Certifications lapsed. No real consequences. The case isn't just about one woman. It's about what happens when power protects predators and a system lets them disappear without a scratch. So let's jump into it. And in the comment section, please let me know what you think on this case. On YouTube, press subscribe wherever you're listening. Shavaun, let's dive into this. Sandra was groomed by a police officer, starting as a minor. Now, unfortunately, we hear the story quite often of someone grooming a kid, ending up for sexual purposes. It's a little different here, because this is someone who went into a place, the Police Explorers program, coming from kind of a rough life.
Yeah.
And thinking, okay, I found people who I like here, people who make me feel included, people who are giving me a path for my future, and I want to be a police officer. So there's a lot of trust that's put there when escaping another dark world. How does grooming by someone in uniform differ than other types of grooming from folks that are not in that sort of a role?
It's that position of trust. And I think particularly for a young girl who needed nurturing, who needed parents, she had lost her mother, she needed a father. She didn't need someone to have sex with. But there is that sense of, if it's a doctor, which we hear about those awful cases sometimes, someone in law enforcement, there's just an added trust that this person is legitimate, that you can count on them, and that they have your best intentions in mind. And clearly, we hear about these awful stories where this turns out to be the opposite.
What is really disturbing about it is, still at this day and age, you'd think, we're a little more educated on this in our society, about reporting things, about getting word out there, about stopping things. She talked about this relationship with Farwell to many people for many years, going all the way back to her being a minor, a child. And no one did anything. Nobody stepped up. Nobody said, hey, we should look at this department further. Or I guess the question is, or did they? And it was all just meeting the doorstop of the police department, not, being the ones to look in on themselves. But from what we understand, she was talking, and a lot of people were just kind of looking the other way. I don't know what that is. Is it just not wanting to get involved in this messy, icky situation? Or what is it? When we have children talking about relationships with people very much older than them, and people just going, well, I remember seeing that as a teenager. Granted, that was, 30 years ago.
Right.
But it still seems to go on to this day.
Yeah, we like to think that people have learned a thing or two. And certainly we came up with rules for mandated reporters for people like medical staff and doctors and therapists, of course. We all have to legally report any kind of contact, sexual contact that a minor has with an adult. And that's the way it should be. But you would think that other people would step up and do the right thing. And so you have to wonder about the social network that Sandra ran in, that so many people didn't see this or didn't know what to do. Again, it doesn't speak well of our society that we're not as advanced as we like to think we are.
No, I mean, in my memory, I remember early high school, hell, even late junior high, which is disturbing, that like freshman year, sophomore year, several girls bragging about their 25, 26-year-old boyfriends. And in their mind at that time was they had it going on. They're, I got a man, that sort of a thinking. And I guess it really hasn't gone away all that much in society. And it's hard to change a teenager's mind about what's going on in their life when they think it's all hunky-dory and wonderful. They don't even realize they're being abused.
Exactly.
Have we gotten better at this? Have we gotten better as a society, educating people, educating kids about this sort of thing, reporting this sort of thing? Or is this just as rampant as it's always been?
Yeah, it would be nice to know how to get research on that.
Yeah.
I certainly don't hear as many kids bragging about it. I think it still happens a lot. It happens a lot through social media and the internet where, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls are groomed by older males. When parents find out, I have seen a lot of cases where parents take action and report that, and law enforcement takes action. But there does seem to still be far too much acceptance of it. And the teenage girl is flattered. These guys are so manipulative. They make them feel special. Usually these girls need love and attention. They need a father, and they don't need a boyfriend that's old enough to be their father in some cases. But it's appalling and surprising. And the way that this horror story ended is just one of the saddest things that we've talked about.
The fact that there were so many of them that all knew she was an easy target. They heard she was, I don't know, I don't want to be crude or anything, but that she would do things with them, I'm guessing, by, and she didn't think anything of it because it was so normalized in her life from such a young age. From what we know, she was isolated, pregnant when she died. Isolation, obviously a big thing, factors a lot into their the psychological control in an abusive relationship. Lived alone, had minimal contact with a support system outside of Farwell. So when you got that, that's your world. And it's been your world for quite some time. And you don't expect that world to want to get rid of you, especially if you're believing that, you're pregnant and maybe there's a future here. That's the weird thing about all of this is she was willingly participating but groomed from such a young age. What do you say to people? And I've heard this, and I just always shake my head because we're not at that place in time either. Because the argument I get, and I think it's regionally, I think where a lot of this comes from in different regions of the country with what's been normalized and what's not, is, well, my grandparents met when she was 15 and he was 25 and they're just fine. You hear people normalizing this or trying to normalize it by things that happened, 80 to 100 years ago. Well, it worked for them. How do you get through to somebody that's, justifying that sort of a way of thinking? I mean, granted, back then, I guess we didn't look at it as grooming. Sometimes it was just more arranged than it was grooming. It's like, you will marry this person. But sometimes it was. I mean, hell, look at the music of the era. It's all talking about doing things to kids. It's horrible.
That's true. That's true.
So how do you address that? With someone who's trying to normalize this, saying, well, yeah, it did happen when she was younger, but she became an adult, and she was an adult for 5 years, roughly, legally, 18 to about 23. So this shouldn't be a big deal. Obviously, murder is a big deal, but people will argue that, well, it's still not grooming. It's not this, it's not that. It just seems like a continuation of grooming from childhood into adulthood.
Very much so. And clearly, when you look at the situation with all the other officers who were involved with her, she was desperate for love. And she had learned that the only way she got affection, apparently, was through meeting men's desires sexually, which is just tragic. And, when I don't run into that often with the people that I see who would justify something like that. I do run into parents finding out about these kind of relationships and being very angry and trying to take legal action. So I think, again, it probably depends on the part of the country country you're in and the social circles that you run in. But, I would go back to this as a kid. The brain isn't even mature in anybody until they're 25 years old. That's why you see so many horrendous outcomes from teenage marriages in the statistics. Yeah. They don't have judgment at that age, and they are being exploited. And I think we just have to keep repeating that like a broken record.
And it would be so difficult, honestly, I think, for Sandra to see what was going on in her own world because she was just so close to it. It raises the question of consent when you have this kind of a power imbalance. It's extreme. Obviously, you don't have consent when they're underage. You also don't, it doesn't mean they're suddenly consenting when they're of age either. Is it ever consensual when you have a situation like this where she's been groomed by these officers, she's known them since childhood, and now she's sleeping with them. And they're just like, all right, let's pass her around, it seems, allegedly. That's a big thing. Is that ever consensual after you've been groomed by these very people? And that person may think it is at that moment in time, that victim, but is it really?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a gray area when you have a person who is perhaps not psychologically well. And I think, you can look at it legally. It may be considered consent over 18, but on a psychological level, maybe this person is just always going to be a target for predators. I worked with a sex offender in the past who targeted young women. Now, they were over 18. He had been arrested for offending against children. And so I was working with him years later to try to keep him from offending again. It was when I was working in one of the forensic programs. But the way he got around it very strategically, he found mentally handicapped women over 18 who clearly were not capable of understanding who this guy was and what his history was, but he would sweet talk them, and they all fell in love with him because they thought he was such a great guy. But they clearly were not of normal IQ, and he had a radar for finding the vulnerable, which was just horrifying. Yeah. But legally in that program, there was very little we could do about it because they were over 18. And if we had them come in and interview them, of course, I'm in love with him. So, we've got this messy situation in our society.
Let's go back into the case of Sandra Birchmore. Let's talk about some of the long-term effects of survivors on something like this. Obviously, she was a survivor until she was murdered. But there's a lot of people out there who go through the abuse and survive, and their abusers, drift off into life somewhere else. Let's talk about the effects that survivors of this type of exploitation carry if they escape the relationship but never see justice served. What are they looking at in that world?
I think if it's someone that gets insight, let's say they turn 25, they get out of that relationship, and then they look back, I think they most often blame themselves. And that's a very common theme. And if there has been abusive sex, which there was in this case, apparently he was very kinky and had the paraphilias, and even when she was in her 20s, he would have her role play a 13-year-old, and she went along with these things, violent fantasies. They feel shame, they feel guilt, and they blame themselves for it. And sometimes there's some PTSD symptoms of trauma, and they have trouble relating normally to normal men in relationships. It can haunt them.
We recently learned that Farwell was not the father of Sandra's unborn child. That's an interesting angle to this. It certainly doesn't change the charges because at the time, he believed he was. Mm-hmm. I think she believed he was. Mm-hmm. There's no evidence to point that she was trying to gaslight him or make something up. She, I think, legitimately thought that he was the father of the child. Obviously, he's not. So it kind of tells us, who else is there that's out there in this orbit? Are we ever going to hear from who the hell that was? And it does make me wonder, maybe a paternity test should be done for every officer in the Canton Police Department over there.
That was my thought.
Yeah.
I would look at everybody. Yeah.
It's, like you don't know who or where or what. Because I would guess you're going to find some interesting things and a lot of people that don't want information coming out. Is it common for predators to show like surface level affection or protection towards their victims? The victims have to believe they're being cared for in some way, shape, or form.
100%.
So what,
100%.
What are some of the things, if someone is looking at their world, whether they're the 15, 18, 20 some year old, whatever it may be, questioning some relationships in their life, or the parent that is involved in that child's life, unlike I think a lot of the situation here with Sandra, but who is seeing, this is kind of odd, what's going on over here? What are some of those things to look for? And maybe some of those men who are a little bit too old to be hanging around, the 18-year-old or the 15-year-old in any setting.
Yeah, always looking for that power imbalance in age. You see it with people who have wealth and they start bestowing gifts, ridiculous gifts on someone. But I think the biggest one is the flattery and the continual message that this younger woman is special in some way. And that's, I think, what really appeals to their ego. But whenever you see an older male paying lots of attention with gifts or flattery or, here's a special trip for you, we can even, turn this to Michael Jackson. And the way it's reported, I think, with a lot of credibility, that he groomed vulnerable boys and made them feel special and showered them with gifts. It's like red flag, red flag, red flag.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Farwell's no Michael Jackson, but it doesn't take necessarily money and it doesn't take exorbitant things to achieve that, especially if you're coming from a world with not a whole lot of anything. If he's taking you out to McDonald's, if he's just showing you little bits of attention that others would look at and go, that's all the attention you get. But to someone who doesn't have any of that in their life, they're just trying to grasp for any bit of it they can get. And that's got to be confusing.
Very confusing. And they are in such internal pain and loneliness and feeling, unloved. And so a little bit of nurturing goes a very long way for them.
Especially when you get to the area of protector versus predator. Because if no one wants to look at a relationship and go, hey, my lover's a predator, they're going to want to see that person as a protector. And when you're that age and you've had that sort of grooming your whole life, I mean, obviously Sandra was murdered, but to come to that realization, let's say she stayed alive, do victims of this ever kind of come around to see it that way? I mean, obviously some do, but is that more common than not? Do a lot of people just kind of continue on with life, either with that predator that is now their protector, more so just their controller, or how does one kind of pull themselves out of that? Because it would require kind of realigning everything in your world, because your compass would be completely, basically remanufactured if you come to that conclusion of the person you're with.
I think the majority, it takes a long time, and often until they get into middle age and are sort of doing that reflecting on their life that we all tend to do in middle age, looking back at our history and deciding where we want to go in the future. It's one time that a lot of people go to therapy to try to focus in and say, gee, where were my missteps here? And that's, I think, when the majority can start to reflect and look at the history of relationships. And, another one that comes up, I remember a teacher when I was in 7th grade who gave me lots of extra attention and really commented inappropriately on my appearance. I mean, I look back at it now and, oh my gosh, every red flag goes off. But when I was in 7th grade, I really liked him. He made me feel good. He made me feel special. So I think it takes a lot of time and wisdom and looking back over our histories before we see it.
these groups like this, it's one thing when it's the police and it's the Explorers program. They can control the narrative pretty good because they are the police. But there's all sorts of groups out there that we hear all the time. And so in this group is involved with doing things to children. And obviously it happens all of the time. And a lot of these people have no past record. It doesn't mean they didn't do anything. It means so that they probably haven't been caught doing it. They really had a system around it. But when you have that sort of a situation, people do what they can. Hopefully, a lot of organizations don't even run background checks on people that are hanging out with children or involved with them. But the ones that do, nothing comes up.
They may not find it. Yeah.
And if you don't have that, then it becomes a gut thing. Then you got to take a look at who you're hiring, who's coming in, and who's going to be acting certain ways around children. How do we better recognize these signs of grooming and emotional abuse before it ends in tragedy?
That is one of the insidious things, is that the people who are good at this present wonderfully. And again, the churches, Boy Scouts, teachers in many cases. It seems like every week there's a horror story about a teacher, some of them women now. It's how to see red flags when there's nothing in the history. And I think probably the majority of cases, there's nothing in the history. My gosh, would in-depth psychological testing catch some of it? Maybe, but that would cost, you're looking at large-scale psych testing of every police officer, probably not economically feasible. But in an ideal world, we would take a very close look at anybody who's unmonitored around children. Doctors, we can think of the doctor that was, the Olympic doctor and molested all the gymnasts for years. It's like these people know how to present as pillars of society.
If we were to do that, obviously, yes, there's so many things that are prohibitive of it. We don't have enough people to probably execute these tests.
We do not.
And carry them out, number one. Number two, the cost of it, and I hate that, but that's the world. But let's just theoretically say we did, that we were able to do in-depth psychological testing on all these people in power. Do you think we'd be surprised by how many people wouldn't pass the test?
I would guess we would be surprised. Yeah. I know that they do testing for nuclear plants and for good reason. I don't know the percentage of people that they rule out, but they do rule a significant number out. They should do it for correctional officers. They should do it for law enforcement officers. And I think a lot would be filtered out. A lot of law enforcement people who apply for law enforcement jobs are filtered out. But, again, it's not through the kind of in-depth psychological testing that I think would catch more.
In your experience, we get the victim here who committed suicide or murder staged as a suicide. But there's a lot of people who that's not how it ends. They end up by themselves, isolated. Their abuser maybe stays, maybe goes. How do you handle that as a psychotherapist when somebody comes to you? Maybe they've made a realization. Maybe not even they haven't made a realization. They just know something's wrong in their life. How do you help someone like a Sandra Birchmore if she came to you to see what was going on in their world? I can't imagine it's a quick wake up, look at the world. It's got to be a couple steps in before to allow them to see that.
Yeah, helping them feel safe, being that heart-to-heart connection where they feel accepted, where they feel understood, and then gradually going over, I like to do that with all my clients, going over a timeline of their lives. What were the good points? What were the not so good points? What was pivotal in your development, and then kind of trying to connect all the dots with where you are today. And often at that point, you can get some insight from them when they look back at their relationship history. And ultimately, these kind of grooming predatory relationships, most of the time they don't end well. They end with someone being hurt in some way, being cast off, maybe after they've had several children with that person, and helping them have compassion for themselves and have empathy for themselves and see that they deserved better than what they got in life thus far. And then, of course, helping them build a support system. Sometimes, there are groups for women who have had a lot of trauma in the past, and that can really be a thing that helps.
Craving non-stop true crime updates? Press subscribe now and get the latest cases, analysis, and expert commentary delivered straight to your feed. Only from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.